very excited to make a return to the world of tablets, and specifically an Android-based option from ALLDOCUBE. The name should sound familiar since earlier in the year I covered an older model of theirs with the iPlay60 Mini Pro, which was a very solid budget option for smaller tablets. ALLDOCUBE returns to this small form factor, but this time around the iPlay60 Mini Turbo brings some interesting upgrades over its predecessors and makes the jump to Qualcomm with the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 chipset. The Turbo version has the potential to carry on the torch from prior models, with it focusing on price to performance again, and could very well become the budget option, at least in this form factor. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we turbocharge back into the world of Android tablets and find out if this mini tablet from ALLDOCUBE offers real value for the price. As we always do, let's talk specs and properly introduce the iPlay60 Mini Turbo, which brings some new features over the iPlay50 Mini Pro, which I've covered here before, as well as the recent side grade of the iPlay60 Mini Pro. I think ALLDOCUBE really needs to rethink their product naming because it's very confusing, much like this package, which doesn't seem to tell you which tablet you're actually getting here. Now on one side it does say Mini 2 and 128GB, and so it's a good start, I think. Other than that, the package is pretty clean, and while I undo the sleeve here, let's go over the chipset that powers this Turbo tablet, which is equipped with the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1, which is the first time that I've talked about this chipset here on the channel. The 6 Gen 1 is built on the 4nm fab process, and it features 8 cores with 4 Cortex-A78 cores at 2.2 GHz and 4 Cortex-A55 cores at 1.8 GHz, and features the Adreno 710 for graphics. Similar to the iPlay50 Mini Pro and the iPlay60 Mini Pro, the Turbo has an 8.4-inch in-cell IPS display with a resolution of 1920 by 1200 with a 270 ppi and 350 nits of brightness, which is lower than I'd like to see, and we will definitely talk a little bit more about the display in just a bit. The Turbo is sold in one configuration with 8GB of LPDDR5 RAM, and it is advertised as having 16GB of unified memory, which is just another way of saying it has 8GB of virtual RAM in addition to the physical RAM available here. Ironically, the device did not have the virtual RAM enabled out of the box, and honestly, it's probably best to just leave it turned off. It has 128GB of internal UFS 3.1 storage, and does provide the option to expand storage with the microSD slot, which is a nice change of pace from some of the more recent tablets that I've covered here on the channel. We've got Wi-Fi 5 on board, Bluetooth 5.0, and a USB Type-C for data, charging, and video out, which is a new addition thanks to the inclusion of the Snapdragon chipset. On the front, we've got a 5-megapixel camera and a rear 13-megapixel camera. Now, a welcome improvement over the iPlay50 Mini Pro is the addition of a second speaker, which was easily one of the weakest things about the iPlay50 Mini Pro. On the left side, right next to the speaker, we have the USB Type-C port, which is a bit off-centered here on the Turbo and resembles both Pro versions of the iPlay50 and iPlay60 Mini. We will be checking out some telescopic controllers and see how they fit with Turbo later on in this video. Out of the box, the Turbo ships with Android 14, and it's a nice and clean build of Android with just the usual Google loaded software, and the only app I noticed that was not standard was the inclusion of an app called FFT that was not in English when I opened to check it. This can be easily removed, and so just be aware that it is not standard with Android, but appears to be harmless. We've got a 5500 mAh battery, which comes right in the middle between the iPlay50 Mini Pro that has a 5000 mAh battery, and the iPlay60 Mini Pro, which has the largest battery out of the three at 6050 mAh. In addition, the Turbo supports 18-watt fast charging, and in the package, a USB-C to A cable was provided, as well as a power adapter that unfortunately was not for my region, so I'll be putting it aside. As usual, I'll be doing the full testing of the battery capabilities towards the end of this video. Outside of the tablet, cable, and power adapter, there is a brief user guide sheet and a tool to get the microSD tray out. The iPlay60 Mini Turbo is available for ordering from the ALLDOCUBE AliExpress page, and I suspect that it will make its way to Amazon at some point soon. The Turbo is priced at $149 US, and I actually purchased this unit myself directly from their AliExpress page for $135 US shipped with some sale coupons, which I always recommend looking out for, and I think at $135 has the potential to be a very solid budget option for many users out there. And it all really starts with the build quality of the tablet itself, which has an identical chassis to the iPlay60 Mini Pro, which I actually have here on hand. This is very similar to the iPlay50 Mini Pro as well that I reviewed earlier in the year. And I have found in general that these tablets from ALLDOCUBE are nicely made given their price points. I will comment and say that the finishing on the back of my iPlay50 Mini Pro did start to rub off at one area on the back, and I suspect the same could happen to the iPlay60 mini tabs that I have here, so just be aware of that. Outside of that, they're not going to blow anyone away with their finishing. Even the display here is nothing groundbreaking, which at a resolution of 1920 by 1200 gives us a fairly decent PPI of 270, and so text and images are decently sharp, but it's definitely starting to show some of its shortcomings with a lower resolution display. And I'd love to see ALLDOCUBE move to something a bit higher res in the future. Now the viewing angles are solid though, and games do look really nice on the display, but I will say that the display is a bit dimmer than I like to see with just 350 nits of brightness. And while it is certainly more than enough indoors in a fully lit room, I don't think this is a tablet that will do well outside on a fully sunny day, especially here in Arizona. If you're familiar with the iPlay50 Mini Pro or the iPlay60 Mini Pro, the panel here is essentially the same, and is pretty much in line with what I've seen at this price point, and in some cases better. Long story short, I've used far worse displays, but I've also used far better ones, and so it's just perfectly average. Now I mentioned earlier that the audio experience should be a bit better here since ALLDOCUBE did add that secondary speaker to the iPlay60 mini line, and the audio experience on the iPlay50 Mini Pro was pretty awful with just that single speaker. And while the inclusion of that secondary speaker certainly makes the experience an improvement, it's still nothing groundbreaking. But it's definitely louder and naturally has better sound separation since we're dealing with two speakers now. I would like to see ALLDOCUBE address the volume scaling through an update since at about 50% volume, the audio is barely noticeable. So let's listen in on those speakers for just a moment. And I've been talking quite a bit about the iPlay50 Mini Pro and its variant, the iPlay60 Mini Pro, since these two tablets are essentially the predecessors to the Turbo, which were equipped with the MediaTek Helio G99 and certainly were decent performers given the price point. But with the Turbo now invading the Pro's territory, how does the Turbo fare in terms of performance, and does it bring more to the table over the MediaTek Helio G99 with its Snapdragon 6 Gen 1? So as we always do, let's first run some synthetic benchmarks to get an idea of where the Turbo stands against the Mini. By the way, let me know down in the comments if you like my new updated graphics for the benchmark section, which I spent some time sprucing up and will be the standard moving forward for new videos. We'll start out with Geekbench 6 first, which will give us a good idea of CPU performance, and the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 in the Turbo came in with a multi-core score of 2,924 and a single-core score of 941. But how does that compare to the Helio G99 that's found in the iPlay50 and 60 Mini Pro, which came in at 1,848 for the multi-core score and 710 for the single-core score? Without a doubt, we're seeing a very nice uptick in CPU performance here with the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1. So now moving to the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme test, which will give us an idea of GPU performance. The Turbo came in with an overall score of 608, and let's now bring in the score for the Helio G99, which came in with an overall score of 340, and essentially has half the score of the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1. So we are definitely seeing a very nice gain here with the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1. Now let's bring in those Antutu scores, which will give us a good idea overall of the synthetic performance with the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1, scoring 546,645 overall, and very much in line with the claims made by ALLDOCUBE. Now let's grab those overall scores for the Helio G99, which came in with an overall score of 403,732, and again we are seeing a very nice uptick in performance with the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1, and this is pretty exciting stuff since the Turbo is coming in at a price range very similar to its predecessors, which means that this is the new baseline for performance in these budget tablets and should translate to some meaningful gains in the real world. Finally, I always like to take a look at the thermal stability using the Wildlife Extreme stress test, and despite this tablet not necessarily being designed for gaming in mind or having active cooling, the stability is quite good, coming in at 99.2%, with the best loop score of 609 and the lowest loop score of 604. It does show that the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 is really efficient. and I will be recording surface temperatures later on in the battery section. Now before we dive into some gaming, we do need to gear up, and as usual, I've got a nice selection of some great telescopic controllers that I found to work very well with the iPlay60 Mini Turbo. And I have them arranged here going from right to left from the smallest to the largest, with the compact Gamesir X2S, the Gamesir GA Plus, which is my favorite for this year, the newcomer the ABXYLUTE S9, and the expensive Razer Kishi Ultra. Let's first talk about the Gamesir X2S, which is available now in both a Bluetooth and USB Type-C option. Now, something to keep in mind about the USB-C version of the X2S is that the Turbo does have an off-centered USB Type-C port, and if you notice, the X2S has the USB-C connection on the left side, which means that the tablet will sit a bit lower than the controller. Despite that, it's a fairly decent fit and pretty secure once attached to the tablet. With the Bluetooth version though, you will be able to adjust how the controller sits with the tablet, and so personally for me, I do like this version, and it does have a similar grip to the USB-C one. Now you probably notice on the back that the springs are exposed, and that's because both versions of the controller are only designed to go to a certain length. And so you will have to do that secret or not so secret trick to pop out the middle and then be able to extend either version of the controller over any size tablet, including the Turbo. Otherwise, this is not a bad compact option that is quite affordable with a decent build quality and very subtle clicky face buttons and D-pad. Now I've got another Gamesir option here, and if you're familiar with the channel, you'll know just how much I really enjoy using the Gamesir GA Plus, which is an improvement over the prior Gamesir GA Galileo, but this time drops the USB-C port in favor of Bluetooth that still manages to have excellent latency times. The Bluetooth lets us do some fun things with the Turbo, which I will save for some emulation in a little bit. Now the GA Plus is a larger option, but has equally larger full-sized buttons, triggers, and analog sticks. The materials and finishing here are very good, but this is a slightly more expensive option over the X2S. Now one thing I like about the GA Plus is that it works right out of the box with the Turbo, and doesn't require the pop-out trick, and so you're not putting any strain on those springs. You can see how nicely the Turbo sits when docked in the GA Plus, and for me personally, it continues its reign as one of the better options in the telescopic controller market. But I was excited to bring back the ABXYLUTE S9, which is a newcomer to the telescopic market, and the version I have here is a pre-production unit. The reason I was particularly excited about trying this out again is that the S9 does support smaller tablets like the iPad mini out of the box, and so I figured this would be another good option out of the box for the Turbo, and definitely one worth considering since it is priced nicely and is built quite well with lots of great features. You probably noticed that this is a USB-C option, but unlike the X2S, the plug sits on the right side, and so the Turbo will sit a bit higher than the controller as a result. The fit with the Turbo is excellent and quite secure, and I will say that the final version will include a piece to give further support to smaller tablets, but just as is, it makes for a nice option, and again it works right out of the box with the Turbo and requires no type of modding. And finally, our fourth and final option I'm showing off here today is the Razer Kishi Ultra, and I partly included this for fun. Despite it being quite an amazing and comfortable controller, this is the most expensive option here by quite a significant amount, and costs more than the tablet that I'm about to dock in here at a retail price of $150 US. It's a shame because this controller is yet another option that fits the Turbo very well and is secure with a great fit. The Kishi Ultra has full-size inputs and a solid build quality, and like the prior two options, does not require any mods and fits right out of the box with the Turbo, which means that 3 out of the 4 options I've shown off here are great matches for the Turbo and make for an awesome combination when gaming. And we're all geared up now, so let's get into some actual gaming, and I'll start out with a selection of native Android games, and I'm pretty excited for this because I think we will be able to get more out of this newer model of the iPlay60 Mini. The Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 should allow us to at least get into some of the more demanding experiences, but again, don't expect miracles, since at the end of the day, while it's a solid improvement over the Helio G99, the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 is still a budget chipset from Qualcomm. Let's first dive into some Diablo Immortal, which is a game I enjoy testing on these tablets and one that is returning here, and I have to say the performance with the Turbo is very solid. I am set to use the default settings that were applied when I first launched the game, which is the medium preset, and the game is very smooth with that setting. Unfortunately, I have to gauge visually how things are performing in the Android gameplay portion of this showcase since I don't have access to any frame counter overlays that will allow me to record those numbers, and it's a bummer since Android 14 does have it built in as long as the manufacturer allows access to it. Now, a game that is definitely more demanding than Diablo Immortal is Call of Duty Warzone, which is another game that is a good showcase for these Android devices, And for this game I went with the smoother gameplay preset, which prioritizes frame rate and then reduces visuals to achieve the smoother frame rate. The trade-off is worth it since we are using a smaller tablet here and the gameplay is quite smooth with this setting, and it seems to be keeping up with the fast-paced gameplay of Call of Duty Warzone. Let's continue on with another game that I enjoy picking up and playing with its fun gameplay and great visuals. Star Wars Hunters is another one that I really enjoy featuring for these showcases, since the game is nicely optimized and does seem to run very well on a range of devices. On the Turbo, I have the game set to use the medium visual quality with anti-aliasing turned off, a 30 frames per second target, and 100% resolution scale, and this game is running as smoothly as possible with these graphical settings, and it's a real treat with a telescopic controller like the Razer Kishi Ultra that I have here. But we're not quite done yet with the Android showcase, and another that has been a consistently popular request is Wuthering Waves, and this is another game that is excellent to judge some performance since it's very demanding on the higher end, but like some of the other options here, has excellent scaling for less powerful devices. Wuthering Waves is set to use the medium graphics quality with a medium resolution and a 30 frames per second cap. And I'd say that gameplay is quite smooth with these settings, and as always this game is a blast to play, and I think for fans of Wuthering Waves this is a great and affordable combination. Of course, I can't talk about Android without featuring some Fortnite, which is available from the Epic Games Store as a separate download direct from their website. I have Fortnite set to the low quality preset with a 75% resolution scale, low texture quality, and a 30 frames per second cap. And these were the settings that applied using the auto preset option, and so there is possibility for some room to scale these settings. Regardless, with these graphical settings, the game does very well from the start of the match with just the usual dip initially at the drop, but after that point is consistently staying at its target of 30 frames per second regardless of the scenario, and thankfully Fortnite does have a built-in frame counter so we can properly gauge that performance here with the Turbo. Finally, I always like to highlight a premium Android experience for these videos and to continue my efforts to spread awareness of the Play Store's library of solid games that were ported to the Android platform with premium buy-it-once types of experiences. I have an entire playlist dedicated to these games that feature controller support, and I definitely recommend checking them out. Recently, a great game received a native Android version with a port to the Play Store, and Halls of Torment is a horde survival game similar to Vampire Survivors. And I highly recommend checking out this awesome port that features full controller support and is an awesome experience on the platform. I think my favorite thing about Halls of Torment is the awesome aesthetic that reminds me of games like Diablo, but mixed with the gameplay of a Vampire Survivors type. Okay, so with all that Android gaming out of the way, it's time to see how that Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 fares with emulation, and I'm hoping that we do see some gains over the prior generation with the Helio G99, since we did see some decent gains during the benchmark section that should translate here in the real world. Let's start out with the PlayStation consoles and dive right into PlayStation 2, which you may or may not remember was something that I recommended sticking to much lighter games with the iPlay60 Mini Pro. And not only that, but I generally recommended to use the PAL versions to get the most performance out of that Helio G99 on a tablet. But things definitely change a bit here with the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1, and I'd say we have some appreciable gains here. First off, I went ahead and only tested NTSC versions of games for the PlayStation 2, and so I started out with something lighter like We Love Katamari, which is returning from that iPlay60 Mini Pro video. I have We Love Katamari set to use 3 times the native resolution of the PlayStation 2, which is just awesome to see here, and it looks fantastic on this display with the upscaling. But let's test a few of the heavy hitters, and I've got a roundup of games here, and I am pleasantly surprised since we've gone from keeping expectations in check to being able to move into some of the more demanding experiences with PlayStation 2 emulation, and games like Burnout Revenge, for example, is running very well here at the native resolution of the PlayStation 2. Many longtime viewers know just how much I love the Burnout franchise, and in particular Burnout Revenge for the PlayStation 2, which is just an awesome racing game from Criterion. And speaking of Criterion, I always love showing off some Black, which many don't realize is developed by Criterion and a departure from their usual racing games that they're known for. But Black is a great first-person shooter with tons of explosions and lots of chaos on screen, and it's a great demonstration for performance with PlayStation 2 emulation, which I have Black here set to use native resolution, and the gameplay is very smooth. And we can now enjoy God of War 2 at native resolution using the NTSC version, and for the most part it stays locked at or close to that full 60 frames per second. And regardless of the amount of gameplay time, the performance does not fall behind since the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 is very stable in terms of thermals, which we saw in the benchmark section, and we will see again in the battery testing. Finally, for one last heavy hitter, I have Shadow of the Colossus set to use the native resolution as well with the NTSC version, and performance is staying steady and gameplay is smooth, and for this game in particular, I didn't notice any real drops in frame rate, and again I am very impressed overall with PlayStation 2 performance, and while the entire library won't be perfect here, I think we are realistically getting into the territory of most games being playable at that native resolution, and then for the one-offs needing some tweaks. Let's switch platforms and move on to another staple of emulation on Android with PlayStation Portable using the PP-SSPP emulator. And just like it was on the prior model with the iPlay60 Mini Pro, PlayStation Portable emulation is an excellent use case here, and performance is very solid. But thanks to the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1, we are definitely able to push upscaling a bit further than in the past. And essentially, I've seen performance gains across the board with PP-SSPP. For example, my usual lighter games like Loco Roco and Lumines can be enjoyed with as much as 9 times the native resolution of the PlayStation Portable, which is certainly overkill on a device like the Turbo with just a 1920 by 1200 panel, but it's always fun to see how far we can push PSP emulation on a device. The excellent results translate to more than just lighter games though, and bringing in some Ridge Racer, I have the game set to use 6 times the native resolution of the PlayStation Portable, and for some reference, I was doing about 3 times the native resolution back on the iPlay60 Mini Pro with the Helio G99. So in many ways, this is in line with some of the synthetic benchmarks we saw, and we're essentially looking at double the capabilities here with PSP emulation. And of course, I can't forget about God of War Chains of Olympus, which equally had gains on the Turbo, and here I have Chains of Olympus set to 3 times the native resolution of the PSP, and I was almost able to push it to 4x, but I did have some dips here and there, so I found 3x to be the best option, which on a device like the Turbo is exactly where we want to be, which is a great setting for a device like the Turbo. It's now time to switch over to the Nintendo side, and first let's talk about some of the fun experiments, and I did test out Cemu for Android, which is still very much a work in progress. But I was curious to see if it was possible at all, since we do have a Snapdragon chipset here, and I did manage to get a few lighter games running fairly well with Cemu on Android. I tried out some fun eShop titles like Race the Sun and Puddle, and I was very surprised that these worked pretty well. And again, Wii U emulation on Android is still very early in development, but it was neat to try it out. The same goes for Switch emulation on Android, which if you follow my channel, you probably are aware that it's been a turbulent year to say the least for Switch emulation in general. But that doesn't mean that we can't experiment, and so I loaded up the latest build of Sudachi that is available for Android, and I had pretty decent success with lighter games using the 0.75x native resolution setting, and it seems to be pretty solid for a number of the games that I tested. And it's definitely a bonus here on a device like the Turbo, but it's still fun to explore. And of course, it shouldn't be the reason to buy this tablet, but if you enjoy tinkering like I do, definitely experiment with this and expect that some of the more stable and compatible games have the potential to work decently here. And if you remember earlier on during the controller showcase, I mentioned another neat feature for Bluetooth telescopic controllers. And since these controllers don't have a USB-C connection blocking anything, we can turn the Turbo into portrait, which means it's the return of TATE mode. And this is a ton of fun and a great way to consume things like the Nintendo DS, which had dual screens, and the DS aspect ratio lends itself very well to this orientation, which allows us to stack the dual screens with the benefits of upscaling and larger screens for each of the displays. It's a real treat, especially when you have games that utilize both screens, such as games like Sonic Colors and Contra 4, but no matter your choice of games on the DS, the Turbo will handle the library very well, and it's a combination that I love bringing awareness to with these tablets, especially these smaller ones. As you can see, the G8 Plus and the X2S both are able to hold the Turbo in portrait mode without issue, so it's definitely something to think about if you're wanting to dive into this with your Turbo tablet. There's not only DS, there's also 3DS, and of course all the great vertical shooters and arcade games that utilize this vertical format. And best of all, there's even some cool Android shmups on the Play Store like Phoenix 2, which is on screen here. Basically, you gotta try TATE mode with your small tablet, it's just a lot of fun. Now, you may or may not have noticed that I skipped some emulation with Gamecube and Wii using the Dolphin emulator. And I actually didn't forget about these platforms. It's just that Dolphin, for whatever reason, is acting very strange with the Turbo. And as much as I want this to be a henshin a go-go, it's more like a henshin a no-go. I spent probably more time on this issue than I care to admit, and I tested just about everything that I could personally think of, and even enlisted the help of some wonderful Discord members over at Retro Handhelds. And on one hand, I'm relieved to know that I'm not the only one with this issue with Dolphin on their Turbo tablet, but I'm also a bit stumped as to what's going on here. I've tested Dolphin on probably well into the hundreds of Android devices. I have never experienced this issue before. As you could probably tell, something is very off here, and regardless if I use OpenGL or Vulkan, the issue persists, and every time I think I've solved it, Dolphin proves me wrong, since there are times when games work very well, as can be seen here in Soul Calibur 2, which I have running at 2 times the native resolution and performance is very solid, but then seemingly launching the game at a different time, Soul Calibur 2 becomes a slideshow despite showing 60 frames per second on screen. Now I know that the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 should be fairly performant for Gamecube emulation, and so this is definitely something that has me a bit confused. And when as far as going back to older development builds of Dolphin, as well as using MMJR, MMJR2, even MMJR3, as well as the Gamecube core in RetroArch, and it's just a complete mess. If you got some ideas, definitely share them in the comment section so I can troubleshoot this and maybe put an update in a pinned comment if this can be resolved. But as it stands now, Dolphin, and as such Gamecube and Wii emulation, is not something that I can say is happening on here, at least consistently, and that's a huge bummer. Now finally, one last use case that I think is great for a tablet this size has been game streaming from a console or your PC, and so I did my usual test with Ori and the Will of the Wisps using Moonlight with Sunshine, and I have Moonlight set to use 60 frames per second, with the native tablet resolution of 1920 by 1200, and we have about an average of 23 to 24 millisecond native decoding time, which is not the worst decoding time I've seen, but certainly not the lowest. I did test several of the different codecs available, and in general I just found leaving it on auto resulted in the best decoding times. Regardless though, gameplay feels very solid with streaming and outside of the native decoding time, which is dependent on your device. The strength of your network definitely comes into play here, which you can see is having no issues on the tablet despite only having Wi-Fi 5. And of course, after all of this gaming, it's time to check in and see how that 5500 mAh battery fares, and as usual, I'll start out with my YouTube test running in 1080p on loop at 50% brightness and 50% volume, with Wi-Fi on and Bluetooth turned off with the battery saver option in Android turned on, and the Turbo did very well despite the smaller 5500 mAh battery, coming in at almost 18 hours of on-screen time, which is downright impressive, and showcases just how efficient that Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 can be, and it's a substantial improvement over the battery performance in the iPlay60 Mini Pro. Now for my usual lighter emulation test, I would normally be going with Yoshi's Island for the Super Nintendo, but thanks to Nintendo's seemingly copyright striking everything, I've switched over to some Mega Man X2, which I'll thank Nate from the RH Discord for suggesting. With Mega Man X2 for the Super Nintendo and using my Absolute S9 attached to it for the duration of this test, the Turbo is again set to 50% brightness, 50% volume with the Wi-Fi still on, Bluetooth turned off, and still using that battery saver option, which did not affect gameplay performance here, and the Turbo managed 13 hours of on-screen time, pretty much on the dot. Again, very impressive performance. Finally, let's end with my higher end emulation test and using God of War 2 for the PlayStation 2 with Nether SX2, using the same 50% brightness, 50% volume, Wi-Fi on, Bluetooth off, but this time naturally I kept the battery saver option off, and God of War 2 at native resolution managed almost 5.5 hours of on-screen time. Again, really solid performance, and if you notice, thermals were not an issue since it maintained its frame rate throughout the course of the 5.5 hour battery test. And despite the higher end emulation testing, the tablet never really felt all that hot in the hands, and surface temperatures mostly remained in the low 30s on both the front and back side, with it just being slightly warm to the touch. And so that about does it for this video, and the iPlay60 Mini Turbo, much like its predecessors, remains a pretty solid and affordable option in the compact tablet space. In terms of just daily use, things like media consumption and using the tablet as an e-reader are all great use cases, in addition to what it's capable of in terms of gaming for both emulation and native Android games. The issue with Dolphin is definitely a concern, and if that is something you're wanting to do with the Turbo, it's important to be mindful of the issue as it may never be resolved. Now there's plenty to like here with the Turbo, which brings Snapdragon to a compact tablet at a price point that is hard to beat, and could very well set the new standard for what is expected in this budget tablet segment, especially in that 8-inch range. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I promise it won't be long before I dive back into another tablet. But until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.